My nightmare stepmother burned all of my late mother's belongings, and by doing so, put my dad in the hospital. I went nuclear on her. My stepmother and I have never gotten along, and I'll never forget the night she drunkenly called me, bragging about the fact that she had just burned all of my late mother's belongings. I burned them. It was all junk anyway. I've always hated how you guys kept her a part of your life. You need to learn to let go. You should look at it as a favor, really. I couldn't muster up any words and just hung up. I sat in silence for a minute before receiving a flood of notifications from her. She was sending me picture after picture of ashes, accompanied by laughing emojis. My dad and I were actually on a camping trip when this happened. I woke him up to tell him. At first, he thought I was joking, but when I showed him the proof, he went pale. He stepped outside his tent, clutching his chest, and started having a heart attack. I called for an airlift. It took 15 minutes for the helicopter to arrive, and we immediately got in. The doctors told me not to get my hopes up. All this was happening while my stepmother was blowing up my phone, demanding that I answer her calls. I ignored them, holding my father's hand the entire time. He made it to the hospital and was admitted to the ICU, where they hooked him up to numerous machines. I sat by his bedside, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall. The thought of losing him was unbearable. I tried to be strong, but the guilt overwhelmed me. I thought that if I hadn't told him, he might have been okay. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. After what felt like an eternity, the doctors managed to stabilize him. They said he was lucky to have pulled through, but he was still in a fragile state. Any more stress could be dangerous, even fatal. For the next few days, I barely left my dad's side. Every time I stepped out of the room, I felt anxious, terrified that something might happen while I was gone. The doctors kept saying he needed rest and that stress was the worst thing for him right now, but it was hard, considering my stepmother had burned all of my mom's possessions. My stepmother had always been bitter about my mom and the sweet things our family would say about her. I remember last Thanksgiving vividly. We were all gathered around the dining table. It was the first time my dad had brought his new girlfriend, my soon-to-be stepmother, to a family holiday. Everyone was curious about her, eager to meet the woman who had finally brought a smile back to my dad's face after years of grief. I was sitting next to my dad, with my stepmother on his other side, her hand resting in his. She seemed a little nervous, but who wouldn't be when meeting the whole family for the first time? My dad kept reassuring her. As we were making plates for the table, the conversation naturally drifted to memories of my mom. It was like that every year. No matter how much time had passed, she was always present in the room with us. Aunt Linda told my stepmother that she was just as beautiful as my mother, Mary, had been. My brother sure knows how to pick them, she said with a smile. There was a murmur of agreement around the table, and I saw my stepmother's smile fade for a moment, but she quickly recovered, nodding politely. As dinner went on, the stories about my mom began to flow. How she made the best pecan pie, how she would sneak an extra slice to my cousin Jake, and how she had a way of making everyone feel special. My stepmother sat there smiling and nodding, but I could feel the tension building in her. When Uncle Joe started the prayer, the energy in the room shifted. We all bowed our heads, and Uncle Joe, who always led the blessing, began to speak. Lord, we thank you for this meal and for the family gathered here today. We ask that you bless our food and our time together. And we especially ask that you continue to bless Mary's soul. May she rest in peace, and may she know that she is missed dearly every day. As soon as he mentioned my mom's name, I felt my stepmother shift uncomfortably in her seat, her hand, which was still holding mine under the table, tightening. I looked up at her. Though her eyes were closed in prayer, I could see how uncomfortable she was. It was in that moment that I realized she was bitter about my mom, about the way we all still talked about her, and about the fact that no matter how hard she tried, she would always be competing with a ghost. When the prayer ended, she quickly let go of my hand and reached for her wine glass, taking a long sip as the rest of the family echoed, Amen. My dad, oblivious, continued smiling. I just smiled at her and gave her hand another reassuring squeeze, but I saw it. One day at the hospital, my dad woke up and was more alert than he had been in days. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he needed to talk to Stephanie. I was scared for him, and scared of what could happen if we pushed her too far, but my dad was insistent. He wasn't the type to let things slide, and I knew that holding on to this, letting it fester, would only make things worse for him. So I agreed. We would confront her, but we'd do it together. We waited until my dad was discharged from the hospital. He was still weak, but we decided to confront her at home. When we got back to the house, the tension was heavy. My stepmom was sitting in the living room watching TV, like nothing had happened. The sight of her made my blood boil, but I kept it together for my dad's sake. He told her they needed to talk, and when she noticed my dad was home, she tried to greet him with open arms. He pushed her away, and she looked stunned. She asked what was wrong with him, and he laid it all out. "You know damn well what's wrong. You burned all of my wife's things," he said. For a moment, she paused and turned red. Then she tried to justify it by blaming my dad for still loving my mom. He told her that while he didn't still love her in a romantic sense, she had no right to burn all of her belongings. Stephanie snapped back, "If you didn't still love her, then why should it matter? They were just things, cluttering up the house," she screamed. I could see my father was getting more upset, and I motioned for him to sit down. I didn't want to take another trip to the hospital. Even though he was weak, he snatched his arm away from me. "This was all she had of her mom, and you threw it all away because you wanted to free up space," he yelled. Stephanie rolled her eyes and said he was being too dramatic. "You can't live in the past forever. It's time to move on," she insisted. My dad told her it wasn't about moving on, it was about respect. That's when I chimed in. The fact that she showed no remorse infuriated me. She told both of us, "This is my house too, and I'm the wife now. If you have a problem with that, then you both can leave." She even said we should be thanking her for removing all of my mom's belongings from the house. "With all that stuff gone, you can both heal faster without a constant reminder that she's dead," she added coldly. My dad, still furious, said he paid the mortgage and that his name was on the documents. He told her she needed to leave immediately. This seemed like the final straw for him, especially since she hadn't visited him while he was in the hospital. Stephanie refused to leave, and the argument got heated. My dad looked pale again, and I forced him to sit down on the couch. I told her to leave him alone, but she didn't care that she was causing him so much pain. Once my dad's color returned and his breathing stabilized, I helped him to bed. The morning after the confrontation was eerily quiet. The tension from the night before hung in the air, impossible to ignore. My dad was still in bed, exhausted and emotionally drained from everything that had happened. I could hear his slow breathing through the thin walls. I made my way downstairs, half expecting to find her gone. But no, she was there, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in hand, as if nothing had happened. She didn't even look up when I walked in. Her focus was entirely on her phone, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen. As I poured myself a cup of coffee, the phone call started. First, it was my aunt. She asked what was going on and why my stepmother had called her in the middle of the night, crying about how my dad and I were ganging up on her and treating her like an outsider in her own home. I tried to explain what had really happened, but the more I talked, the more I realized my stepmother had already convinced her otherwise. Then it was my dad's best friend, calling to say he was worried. My stepmother had told him that my dad was losing it, that he wasn't handling his grief well, and that he was starting to lash out at her for no reason. She made it sound like we were the ones who had crossed the line, like we were the ones who needed help. It became clear that my stepmother was going to fight, and she was going to make sure everyone believed her side of the story. I could see her out of the corner of my eye, still sitting at the kitchen table, smirking as she continued to type away on her phone. I couldn't stand it anymore. I slammed my mug down on the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen like a gunshot. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled at her. She finally looked up and said she was making sure people knew the truth, claiming that my dad and I were clearly not in the right state of mind to handle everything, so she was taking care of it. I laughed, realizing she was serious. I told her that she was lying to everyone, and I knew what she was doing, painting us as the bad guys. She claimed she was just protecting herself and insisted people deserved to know what was really going on in our home. She went on a rant about how she had never been welcomed in our home and how she had been treated as a placeholder ever since my mom died. I told her this was my dad's home and that she was just bitter because she wasn't half the woman my mom had been. I told her she needed to get out, or I would call the police. She stood up slowly, her eyes locked on mine. "We'll see about that," she said before brushing past me, leaving me standing there. As the door closed behind her, I realized this wasn't over. My stepmother was going to fight dirty, and if we didn't find a way to stop her, she would take everything from us. After all the calls from family and friends that she had manipulated, my dad started stressing out, and his health began to decline again. He was constantly anxious, barely sleeping, and the toll on his heart was evident. The doctors warned us that he couldn't take much more of this, and if things didn't change, he might not make it. I couldn't just stand by and watch her destroy him. We needed to get her out of our lives, but she wasn't going to go quietly. That's when I realized we needed legal help. We found a lawyer who specialized in family law, and we started the process of filing for divorce. It was grueling, and my stepmom fought us every step of the way. But the more she fought, the more her true colors showed. She tried to play the victim, painting us as the villains, but it didn't work. The court saw through her lies and the damage she was trying to do. She had no remorse, no empathy, just a burning desire to get what she wanted, no matter who it hurt. The divorce was ugly. She dragged it out as long as she could, trying to drain us financially and emotionally, but in the end, the court ruled in our favor. She was forced to leave, and we were finally free of her. After she was gone, it took time for us to heal. My dad's health slowly improved, but he was never the same. The stress had taken its toll, and he was more fragile than ever. We focused on rebuilding our lives, finding a new normal. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of everything we'd been through felt like too much to bear. But we had each other, and that was enough. We didn't talk much about my mom's things after that. The loss was too painful. But one day, as we were going through some old boxes in the attic, I found a small envelope tucked away in a corner. It was addressed to me, in my mom's handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it, and tears formed in my eyes as I read the words she'd written before she passed. She talked about how much she loved me and how proud she was of the person I was becoming. At the end, she wrote, "No matter what happens, always remember that I'm with you. In every memory, every moment, I'm there." I held the letter close to my chest, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. My mom was gone, but she was still with me, in every memory, in every moment. No one could ever take that away. As time passed, the pain started to fade. My dad and I grew closer than ever. We knew we couldn't change the past, but we could shape our future, and that's exactly what we did. We moved to a new house, a fresh start. On the first night in our new home, we sat on the porch watching the sunset. My dad turned to me with a small smile. "We made it," he said. "Yeah," I agreed. "We did." Through it all, I knew my mom was watching over us. She would have been proud of the people we had become. Update: the story centers on the narrator's deeply troubled relationship with their stepmother, who resents the lingering memory of the narrator's late mother. This resentment culminates in the stepmother burning all of the late mother's belongings while the narrator and their father are on a camping trip. The shocking news causes the father to suffer a heart attack, leading to a tense hospital stay where the narrator struggles with guilt and fear of losing their dad. After the father recovers, they confront the stepmother, who shows no remorse for her actions and justifies them by claiming it was time to let go of the past. The situation escalates, and the stepmother starts manipulating family and friends, casting herself as the victim. The stress from her actions further deteriorates the father's health, leading the narrator to seek legal help. The family initiates divorce proceedings, and although the stepmother fights bitterly to retain control, her true character is revealed in court, leading to her eventual removal from their lives. After the divorce, the father and narrator begin the slow process of healing. The father, although physically weaker from the ordeal, grows closer to the narrator. One day, the narrator discovers a heartfelt letter from their late mother, bringing them peace and comfort. The story concludes with the narrator and their father moving to a new home, symbolizing a fresh start, and finding solace in knowing that their mother's love still guides them.